We're doing some nutrition myth busting today. This idea came from the fact that, well, I guess I do it more in terms of frequency, but myth busting short videos on IG. I actually made a video like this, or a podcast episode like this, not too long ago, doing a deep dive on one of Gary Brecka's stuff, one of Gary Brecka's claims, because the myth busting I think is fun and it's important, but you can only do so much in 60 seconds, right? So we got a couple videos here, a couple that you shared with me, a couple that I pulled up, and we're just gonna break them down. And to preface, we're not gonna be super negative either, because I think some of them, or at least one of them, has some positive information there, and we'll try to be as unbiased as possible, but then talk about some of the messaging and all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And the reason that we want to do this is because it's just important to be able to navigate social media and see through some of this stuff, because a lot of what you're going to see in your feed, if you get on Instagram or any social media platform, you're going to see a lot of this sensational information. It's going to catch your attention. You're going to be curious to know more in many cases. And what we want you to help you do here is be able to see these videos and understand and see the holes in them and see where, these tactics that these individuals use in order to get your attention that are often misleading.
Yeah. Should we just go ahead and jump right into it? Go into the first one?
Yeah, let's jump into it.
All right. First one is by our good friend, Paul Saladino, MD, baby. Let's go.
But no,
Right, here we go.
you are not fat because you eat too much food. You are fat because you eat the wrong foods. And I really think that the corollary of that is that if you are eating good quality food, and everyone is going to, this is not really something that's rocket science, unprocessed animal foods, unprocessed plant foods. If you eat that, you can eat a lot of food. And your satiety mechanisms in your brain, when you're full, are going to work. They're going to tell you when to stop. And then you're done. And then you're done. It's so easy.
All right. I think we've heard enough. I think this is the one that there's some decent information in there, maybe presented not the best way, right? You want to go ahead and kick it off with your thoughts?
Yeah, I think this can sometimes be one of the most dangerous ways that information is presented, because, like you said, there's a lot of truth to what he said. He said if you eat more unprocessed whole foods, you're going to be more likely to not overeat. However, it doesn't just come down to this. If you're eating a whole bunch of olive oil and fatty meats and other really nutrient dense foods, even if they're unprocessed, you're still going to gain weight. And there's still differences between people in satiety mechanisms and their ability to feel full after eating certain foods. Now, yes, if you're eating nothing but unprocessed foods and it's all vegetables and very not energy dense, it's going to be really difficult to overeat. But I think the way that he frames it, when you say it's not the amount of food that you're eating, but the quality of food that you're eating that's making you fat, it's not necessarily true. like it's the calories that come in, and if you're eating higher quality foods, then you're just more likely to eat less calories. But the calories still matter, and the way that that's framed tries to make it seem like they don't.
Yeah. And, I think we're a little bit maybe more apprehensive towards this type of messaging from somebody like Paul, because we know the totality of his message. I think this video in isolation is tough too, right? Because it's a short clip. And maybe he provided a little bit more nuance. But in general, there's a lot of people who argue this, that it's not about how much you eat, it's about what you eat. And the truth is, it's about both. I don't know why people try to make the argument it's one or the other. Yes, it's about how much you eat, but in many ways, how much you eat is also influenced by what you eat, right? And like Adrian, like you were saying, yeah, if you focus on minimally processed foods, and I'll give him props for saying both animal and plant-based, because for the most part, until recently, Paul has been just animal-based. And now he includes some plant-based foods, and he's a little bit more open to discussing the benefits of consuming plant-based foods. So I'll give him props for that. And yeah, in general, if you're eating more minimally processed foods from animals and from plants, if you're switching from a highly processed diet, you're likely to reduce your overall caloric consumption. But where this message can go wrong is if people think like it's all good to just guzzle down peanut butter, right? Like peanut butter is a minimally processed plant-based food, or really high-fat foods. There's people who do gain weight on healthy diets, right? When I say healthy, I'm talking about like nutritionally healthy diets, minimally processed foods. I do that whenever I'm trying to gain muscle and bulk up. Like, I don't just start eating shittier food. I just eat more healthy food, right? So it's not necessarily just about the type of food that you eat. This reminds me of a story I heard on the radio. This is so long ago, but this was, dude, I was probably like a teenager, and I was learning about like nutrition and calories and stuff. And some guy on the radio was talking about just this, like some lady thought that apples were healthy, so she was eating 6 apples on her way to work, and it's like that's probably like 700-800 calories just from apples, like a short period of time. That's not going to be super conducive towards weight loss. But she was just doing that because she thought that apples would help her lose weight. And she thought the more she ate apples, the more weight she would lose. And it's not that simplistic, right?
Yeah.
But
Beyond that, though, I think it's important to also mention that it creates this idea that just avoid all processed foods, and that's the way to lose weight, and you're gonna lose weight if you just avoid all processed foods. And the reality is, like, you can include them in your diet and still lose weight, if that's your goal. Now, and I know some people will think, well, I don't want to eat processed foods because they're not as quote unquote healthy. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on what type of processed food we're talking about. But it's just this dichotomy that people create of like, oh, it's simple. Just don't do this and this will happen. And the reality is like, it's never going to be that simple. And when people present it in that way, it's usually, there's a truth that's missing, and they're explaining it in that very confident way. And you're missing out on some of that nuance that's important if you're trying to make a sustainable habit changes. This type of content is great to indoctrinate you into doing something because they scared you like away from ever eating processed foods. But what happens when you go on vacation or you're just not able to sustain that lifestyle anymore, and then you kind of fall back into it? And then what happens for many people is they get stuck between these black and whites where they keep trying to stick to these idealistic, nutrition habits, and then they fall back into their old habits, and they never build sustainable habits that are more flexible and that are more balanced. And I think that's probably why this type of content rubs me the wrong way. Is it because when you see it, it's like, okay, this makes sense. There's a lot of truth to it. Now I just don't ever eat processed foods again, and I'll lose all the weight that I need to lose. And it's like, there's some truth to that, but there's just better ways to educate and help people understand their body better. Calories matter. We don't need to not explain that to people. That's one of the things that I sometimes wrestle with is some people struggle with the discussion about calories and how important they are because of whatever, uh, whatever they want to say, that the food industry is trying to convince you that you need to pay attention to them, or whatever the case may be. And it's like, this is just science. This is just how our body works. And we need to, it just helps to understand this to help you make decisions.
I do think it's important to talk about processed food, right? Because that's the deeper message is like, just don't eat any processed food and only eat whole foods. And ideally, that would be great. But we also know that processing exists.
Have you ever like just completely cut out processed foods from your diet? Like where you did. So there was a point where I was like, I would not. I mean, I would eat them like here and there, but for the most part, I made everything from scratch. And it was a lot of work. I could not eat enough because I'm super active. I'm 6'1". Like I need over 3,000 calories a day. It's hard to do that if you're eating no processed food whatsoever. And I was even like, oils were something that I wouldn't even really touch. Like no processed foods. These things, these messages, again, they sound good, but in application, I was taking all this time, making my life much more difficult, not able to get enough calories. So my workouts were suffering. I lost muscle. It's like all of these negative effects can occur that you don't expect from advice that seems like it makes sense and it's well-meaning. And this is why, that's why I think some of that stuff rubs me the wrong way. Is it just because you can't? It's hard to watch that and just think like, oh, this isn't correct. it seems like it all makes sense, but it's just these underlying messages that really can get to people and cause people to end up making dietary choices or
Yeah.
nutrition changes that just aren't sustainable.
Yeah, with the processed food thing, I was gonna say like convenience really matters, right? We don't live in a society where like your only responsibilities are to have shelter, to reproduce, and to eat, like our ancestors, quote unquote, right? We're busy, we have busy lives, we have a ton of stuff going on, and so convenience is really important as well. And the truth is that processed foods can be really nutritious, very convenient as well, right? And that should be a controversial statement, and it'll definitely be a controversial statement. And the truth is that people don't understand that processed food exists on a continuum, like we've talked about a number of times. And I'm bringing this up because I posted a video today about like stuff that I'm at Costco, and somebody commented and was like, "How could you buy some of those processed things?" And dude, the only processed things I bought, processed quote unquote, frozen sweet potato fries. Literally, the only ingredients are sweet potatoes, a little bit of salt, and a little bit of oil. Right? Like that is very minimally processed. I would consider that a minimally processed food. I bought some like convenient microwavable brown rice and quinoa packets. And I think I got like one more thing that was also like, technically it's a processed food, but like, come on, And I said it, I'm like, when I don't have time to cook, I just throw one of these brown rice and quinoa packets in the microwave. Helps me get some fibers, some nutrients. It's healthy, super simple thing. Dude, and even like stuff like that, people are like, how can you eat those processed things? I'm like, dude, it's frozen sweet potatoes and bagged brown rice. Like, what are you talking about, But that's what these messages essentially allude to.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I got a comment right before we got on this podcast. It was something I don't even didn't pay attention to, but it was something along the lines of, "I'm not taking advice from a doctor who advocates for processed foods for convenience. That's just lazy." Or like, I didn't even read the rest of it. I was like, another one of these people. Like, what are you talking about? Like, they're just out of touch with reality of the fact that other people's lives might be different than theirs. They may not everyone has that amount of time, the preparation space to make the food, to store the food, to go
But
to the
not only that,
grocery
man, like
store.
there likely is like no objective difference, right? There really isn't probably like any objective difference in terms of health related outcomes if you're following all of the health related principles that we always talk about. It's like you and I have talked about, people put so much emphasis on just nutrition. It's like, yes, nutrition is important. It's one aspect of your health. And whether you cook your brown rice or you buy it in a packet, like it's probably not a massive difference in terms of like the effect that you're gonna have on your health at all.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be like, I would almost argue this. It's hard. Obviously, we don't have data to know what the difference is in these things, but there's probably no difference whatsoever. And like your sleep, your exercise, your overall lifestyle, like all these things matter a ton, right? It's like you're focusing on a fraction of something that doesn't matter at all.
I wish we had like a whiteboard so we could draw it up on the whiteboard of like, this is your overall health. I've done a video like this a while back.
Yeah.
It's like, this is your overall health. And, there's nutrition's a fraction of that. Nutrition it's not everything. You have genetics, you have access to medical care, you have your exercise, you have your relationships, you have your occupation and how satisfied you are with that. There's many factors that influence your health beyond nutrition. And then of all the things you're doing with your nutrition, whether or not you have pre-prepared rice versus rice that you made by yourself, is such an insignificant difference. And these are the type of things that people have come to like become completely afraid of, getting rice in a package. And so they go home and they have to spend 30 minutes making rice, or they don't eat it. And then they, either don't eat or, end up going for convenience options anyway, because you didn't have a pre-prepared option. And so like, if you spent the 30 minutes, the minor benefit that you might have possibly got from that rice, is it worth the 30 minutes that it took you to make it? Like, in many cases, probably not. And I like kind of shifted over the years because like I said, I used to eat mostly like pretty much only unprocessed foods. So that decision making of like including processed foods in your diet, like just weigh the pros and cons.
Yeah.
Making a like we talked about a processed rice, those rice packages, I have the same ones in my cabinet. Like, of course, it's so much easier than to use or than to make it on your own. And if you're not willing to spend that 30 minutes to make it, it's so much better to just purchase those convenience options. Frozen foods work really well for this as well. Like you can buy rice frozen. So one of the issues that some people have, or one of the concerns that some people have, is microwaving like some of those things in the package, because there is like plastic lining, and the heat with the plastic lining may leach into the food. Like that I think is a concern that we don't have enough data on, and it's valid to be slightly worried about that.
Just
And
pull it out.
so, like, you can just take it out and cook it
Yeah.
if you think if you're worried about that. That's typically what I do. Or I'll also do frozen rice, and you can just buy it like brown rice or white rice, like completely frozen. And there's so many different options that a lot of people don't consider, that would make their lives easier, like this, like frozen rices in pouches, uh, canned items as well, that just are very easy to include nutritious foods into your diet.
Yeah, man, I think we have discussed that one enough. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.
Yep.
Which one should we do, grocery or the primal blood?
The grocery.
The grocery. We'll leave the best for last.
Yeah.
If I can end with a bang. All right, let's do the grocery guy.
You might know this brand of sweetener. It's made of saccharin. This one, sucralose, and this one, aspartame. These are the artificial man-made sweeteners that are so bad for your health, for your gut, and have been linked to actually breaking your DNA. There's a huge difference between artificial sweeteners like that and plant-based real sweeteners like stevia, allulose, monk fruit. These are good and safe and good for you. Those are downright bad. If you're a true
Okay, what does breaking your DNA mean?
I don't really know. I mean, I know what it actually means in the context of what he's talking about. Probably absolutely nothing.
It's wild, man. So what angle do you think is best to take with this post or with this video? Because I think both you and I have discussed artificial sweeteners a ton, right? And most of the listeners probably understand, or at least understand, that our perspective is that there isn't really any particular harm with using artificial sweeteners, specifically in the quantities that we do use them, right? I think maybe it's best to talk about the idea of like something that's man-made versus natural, because it's like this whole idea of like, if something is natural, it is inherently better than something that is man-made. And it's a silly argument for a number of reasons. You want to kick it off there?
Yeah, completely agree. I was thinking the same thing. Is you could hear him saying this over and over again, and we naturally gravitate towards this language. When someone says natural, we automatically assume that it should be better for us. Doesn't even require that person to do any marketing. You just say this is natural. You see it on any product that's trying to sell itself as a health food product. It says natural on it, and it doesn't really mean anything. Overall, it doesn't mean healthier. There are many natural products that can kill you. There are many naturally occurring, things in the environment that can kill us. And then at the same token, a lot of things that are not natural, that are man-made, are well studied and have been shown to be very beneficial for our health and have enhanced our lifespan quite a bit. That's one of the things that that's hard. Like, you see people make technology and things like quote unquote man-made out to seem like a bad thing, but these things have really improved our quality of life and length of life over the last 75, 80 years. And one of the things you'll hear with a lot of these influencers is they'll say, everybody's sick and dying. And the data doesn't support that. Like, if we really look at, yes, there are a lot of people who are overweight today, compared to previous times in history. However, cancer rates have not gone up. Heart disease rates have gone down by 66% in the last 75 years. the rates of a lot of chronic diseases have gone down, except we're living longer, so we're experiencing a lot of these diseases more often and dying less from infectious diseases. And I think this is important, is this idea that technology is harming us, and we need to go back to everything that is natural and man-made and ancestral is just I think an overarching kind of thing that a lot of people tend to believe, and tends to get used as a marketing angle a lot, and it's really important to be able to see through that.
Yeah, it's funny because we live longer because of man-made things. We live more comfortably because of man-made things. We have more convenience because of man-made things. People who talk about these things are recording videos on their phones, which is so ironic and hypocritical, right? Like, what's more man-made than a friggin' cell phone? And it's funny because I feel like food is the one place where people are like, nope, if it's man-made, it's bad, right? Whereas they acknowledge like so many other areas of their life where man-made things are positive, right? It's like, why do you sleep on a bed? Why do you live inside a house? Like, those things are quote unquote man-made. They're not quote unquote natural. And I've talked to people before on social media about this when they comment like, how can you put something that's not natural in your body, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, first off, many of the things that we consider natural have been altered to a certain degree, right? So they're not 100% in their natural state. Two, they think it's that man-made is bad simply because it's going inside your body. But people don't understand it's like your body is essentially a tube, right? And even the things that you expose your body to externally still affect your overall health, right? Like, we breathe things in the air. We come in contact with things with our skin. It's like, just because you're consuming something doesn't inherently make it worse if it's man-made, which is a relatively silly argument.
In terms of like man-made versus natural, like you were mentioning, we don't question other areas, but we seem to question more so like nutrition, and it's understandable, because yes, we are a lot of the things that nature gave us, they're very nutritious, they meet our needs, but it's okay for us to take those things and modify them to make them more convenient, to make them last longer, to make them easier to transport, because the reality is that before we were processing foods, food was hard to get, and people were not able to access food as widely as they are today. Now, there's still accessibility issues in a lot of areas and places, but that's one of the things that isn't really talked about, is before we were processing food, oftentimes you don't have a lot of food. Families didn't have access to a lot of food. It's hard to get fruits and vegetables and fresh foods. And even back then, they were processing foods just in different ways. They weren't industrial, like it wasn't industrialized methods of processing, but they were still using methods of preserving foods. But they just didn't have access to these things, because how are you going to get fresh tomatoes or fresh broccoli, or even the fresh foods weren't available before we were able to create these more industrialized food systems that we have today. And it sounds, a lot of times people make these food systems sound scary. You hear this all the time, the industrial food system and industrialized seed oils, but the reality is, this is what has made food available. This is why we can eat things that we enjoy and meet our nutrient needs on a regular basis, most of us, and live a comfortable life on that side of things without having to spend a large percentage of our lives trying to procure a little bit of food just to barely meet our needs and not even eat things that we enjoy. That's what like the industrial food system has made available. Now, are there negatives to that, and does it create a situation where you have to be a lot more disciplined and mindful about your choices, because the choices that are available are plentiful, and there's lots of foods that aren't very nutritious that are very delicious, and they're available, and these companies want to make money and they're trying to sell them to you in various ways? Yeah, all of that is definitely true as well. But this like inherent demonization of progress in technology and in the way that we're able to deliver food and get food into our homes and be able to, get it much more easily than we ever have in all of human history, is that kind of bothers me in a way when I see that stuff. It's just like, I used to do that too. I used to think that way too, until you actually look at the history of human health and the history of our food systems, and you realize, like, we have the most plentiful, abundant, safest food system in human history by far.
Yeah.
And you kind of get caught up in some of the other 90% of the grocery store food is poisonous type content sometimes. And if you lose that perspective on, like, no, things were much worse 50,
Yeah.
60, 80 years ago.
I remember the point I was going to make. And it's going to be a little bit more of like a philosophical perspective, but like essentially these words natural versus man-made, like they don't really mean anything when you start to think about them, right? Because okay, we consider things that are not man-made as not natural, but how do you define natural, right? Because for example, and this is, we would say that an otter building a dam is natural, right? Like that's part of nature. You could also argue that technology and progression is part of nature's course, and it's just what we do as human beings, right? And as human beings, we're animals just like other animals, and this is just part of human behavior. And part of our behavior is part of nature, and it can be argued that it's natural as well, right? We just like make these very arbitrary lines around this is natural, this is not natural. But then when you really even ask somebody like, how do you define the word natural? That's a really difficult question to answer, right? Something that is present without human interaction, perhaps, or without human presence. Well, then there are a lot of things that would be considered natural that also just wouldn't be considered natural, right? Like we talked about, a lot of different fruits, different veggies have changed over the past decades or centuries.
Oh yeah,
Simply
none
because,
of what's in our grocery store
yeah,
would be
exactly.
considered natural.
Exactly, right? So that's the funny part. It's that everything changes. I would argue that a lot of the things that are considered not natural can be considered natural as just part of normal human behavior. And it's just, I think it's just silly to create these arbitrary lines around like, oh, a person made this, therefore it's not good, right? Nature made this. Dude, there's freaking cyanide in pits of like fruits and stuff, and you could freaking die from that, right? So like natural itself doesn't necessarily mean safe or healthy either. And just thinking about it from a common sense perspective, it's like there's a reason why people don't die when they're 40 anymore. There's a reason why average life expectancy, I think it's what, like high 70s, low 80s at the moment, something like that.
Yep.
I don't know, man. It's just, I don't know why people have a hard time thinking. Now, the follow up question to this, to play devil's advocate, Adrian, is why do you think there is such a big issue, and maybe not even issue, but why do you think diseases like obesity are so prevalent, right? Because this is the counter argument that people use. It's like, well, obesity rates are super high, and it's definitely because of processed food. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Obesity rates have always been a like a disease of abundance. Like in
Yeah,
all of human history, the individuals who had access to resources tended to carry more weight.
yeah,
And in today's society, we've created a situation where we've elevated that baseline access to resources in terms of food due to technology and improved food supply and improved ability to grow and distribute food, and then companies taking advantage of some of the subsidies that exist for like corn, wheat, and soy, and turning those things into highly processed foods that are very low cost. But our food system definitely contributes to this to a degree. And to what I just mentioned, I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but like subsidies do help to drive down some of the cost of processed foods. This was inadvertent, but like there was subsidies put in place in the United States to help increase the production of wheat, corn, and soy and other commodity crops. And those subsidies still exist to where the government is funding the production of a lot of these crops, and then the food companies take that and process those products and sell them for a very low cost, uh, probably lower than what they would actually cost to even grow in the first place, because of those subsidies drive that cost down. And unfortunately, that's created a food supply that where there's a lot of low cost, highly processed foods that are made out of some of these ingredients, that are very delicious, that are sometimes difficult to control ourselves around, and that's we just have to be mindful of that. It's not, sometimes people will ascribe that to some type of evil conspiracy to from the food companies and the government and pharmaceutical companies to like take us down, to kill off the population. But the reality is, this is just companies, and we have a capitalist society, and these companies, they make money off of selling product at the lowest possible cost that is going to get people to eat as much as possible of it, and there's not much regulation around what they can and can't put into it, as long as it's not harmful ingredients. Everything has been tested to be safe to eat, doesn't mean it's nutritious. It just means it's not going to harm you. And so there's a difference there, so sometimes these processed foods aren't necessarily harming you, like those ingredients. Yes, all of the different ingredients they put into it, not necessarily harming you right off the bat if you eat any of these, but that also doesn't mean they're nutritious. And that doesn't mean that we need to be filling up our diet with these foods.
Hey guys, some of you may not know that I'm the scientific advisor for a supplement company called Outwork Nutrition. I help with the formulation of new products to help ensure that they're effective and backed by science. Unlike many other supplement companies out there, we don't rely on exaggerated claims or flashy marketing tactics. Instead, we let the science speak for itself. We take pride in formulating products that deliver real results, helping you achieve your fitness goals in a meaningful way. If you're in the market for supplements like protein powder, pre-workout, or recovery products, make sure to check us out at outworknutrition.com. And as a thank you for being an avid listener of this podcast, use code Joey for an exclusive discount at checkout. You can find the link to our website down in the description of this podcast episode. Remember, our goal is to empower you with science-backed supplements that truly make a difference. Choose Outwork Nutrition and elevate your fitness to new heights. Yeah, it's obviously a complicated topic. And the reason I asked the question is because oftentimes I feel like when we talk about these things, unfortunately, people get the message of like, oh, Joey and Adrian are just like puppets for some of these food companies, and they're promoting the consumption of processed foods. I'm like, that's not what we're doing at all, right? I would argue that I'm probably promoting the opposite of that. Like, hey, actually don't eat these foods as much as you want. But there's nothing wrong with having them every once in a while. But it's like, that's unfortunately the message that people get when we're like, oh, like things that are man-made are not bad, or not inherently bad. They can be bad the same way that natural things can be bad. They can also be good the same way natural things can be good. And just because it's man-made doesn't inherently make it worse than it being natural. And then people are just like, man, how can you promote these processed foods? And I don't know how people make the leap from one end to the other, right? Because like you just mentioned, there are issues with some of these foods. Maybe not the way that people explain them, in the sense of like, oh, this food, this ingredient is inherently killing you in any sort of quantity, because we could also talk about the importance of dosage. And yeah, some of these things may have adverse health outcomes at high doses, but we just don't consume them in those doses at all. And that's another nuanced conversation, but it's crazy how, not to get political, but like with politics or anything, like it's either like one side or the other completely, right? And just being in the middle and being like, hey, this being processed doesn't mean it's inherently bad, but you should probably not eat as much processed food as you currently are. And that would probably have a positive impact on your health. People have a really hard time understanding both of those at the same time.
Well, it's because the extremes tend to be the loudest, and you make both extremes mad when you're not extreme. That's right. Like so the people who are like eat it, on both sides of that, don't like that message of like, yes, it's fine to eat these, but you shouldn't eat a lot of them. Like, it's not a good idea to eat a lot of them. That's both sides of the spectrum are gonna get mad about that. And the moderate people tend to be like, oh yeah, cool, I'm just gonna scroll past that and not leave my extreme opinion on that. So I think it just, we skew. I don't think it's that most people are that way. I think we just, unfortunately, you and I interact on Instagram with some of our content, and that we get responses that represent the two extremes on a much more skewed basis. Like that's we're seeing those people's comments much more than everyone else's, and it feels like that's what everyone's doing, but I don't think that's the reality.
Yeah, I guess it also comes down to like the type of person that's motivated to make inflammatory comments on social media. It's probably
Yep.
like some unstable person or somebody who's having a really bad day.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and do the last one on here. Give me 1 second to pull this up. I closed my IG. All right. We are going to do. Dude, it's sad how much this account has been blowing up, the Primal Bod.
Oh yeah.
Because the thing is, like, she's a normal person. She's good looking. She sounds somewhat convincing. And her audience has been absolutely blowing up, dude. Absolutely blowing up. And I don't know how many people she has in it, but she has like a membership type service that's really expensive. That teaches you about living an ancestral lifestyle. It's funny, man, because like I did a podcast with somebody the other day, and like we were talking about this ancestral stuff. And it's like, if you really think about what our ancestors ate, like you don't want to live like our ancestors.
Oh no.
That's like completely skewed. Like our ancestors ate a ton of ribeyes. It's like, yeah, all right.
They eat bugs.
Yeah.
Fat is the ultimate fuel for your mitochondria. So your body wants to hold on to that fat as much as possible. And it does that using insulin. Insulin will sit on your fat cells and it will lock them down. It is the gatekeeper. So insulin gets the glucose to the places it needs to go. And then its next role is any remaining glucose gets taken to the liver and converted into fat. And then it's stored on your ass. And then insulin sticks on that fat cell, locks the receptor down and says, nope, we're not burning this. Fat is the ultimate fuel for your mitochondria. So
All right.
your body wants.
How do we tackle that one? Where do we start?
Oh man. So she's good with the buzzwords.
Yeah.
Like the mitochondria and locking the fat on your hips. Like she knows how to just. This is just marketing. It's just really good marketing. Just throwing together a whole bunch of buzzwords, insulin and mitochondria and fat on the hips, and saying it in a way that's extremely confident and alarmist in a way. I think is it's hard. She's gonna keep growing. Like I hear this one, I'm like, her account's gonna continue to blow up until
Yeah.
yeah. I don't. That's I mean, nothing she said there makes any sense, but it sounds logical. What stands out to you when you hear that?
Well, we understand what her perspective is, right? Like any sort of carbohydrate is just going to keep you fat because it raises insulin. This is one of those people that's like extremely against any slight increase in levels of insulin, and the whole idea that insulin essentially inhibits fat breakdown. And again, these are like half truths, right? Because insulin, in theory, can inhibit fat oxidation, and we can talk about why that doesn't prevent fat loss. But then she just like, again, like you mentioned, uses a bunch of buzzwords. She says that the fat just gets stuck on your ass, and I don't know where that's coming from. And this was obviously a short clip, but her whole message is like, don't eat any carbohydrates because it prevents fat loss, and we should just be eating meat and nothing else. I think we could start the conversation just talking about mechanistically why elevated insulin or elevating your insulin doesn't prevent you from losing body fat, why that's not necessarily the case, and why it's actually a good thing that like fatty acid oxidation is slowed down when we consume carbohydrates or we consume food in general, right? Because it doesn't make sense to be in both an anabolic and catabolic state simultaneously. So it's just your body, essentially your physiology shifting to the particular state that you're currently in, whether you're anabolic eating or catabolic not eating, right? How about we start there?
Yeah, definitely. What do you want in terms of like the insulin? So the insulin's a really complicated topic because insulin has a lot more functions than just fat gain and fat loss, and that's or fat storage and regulating fat storage, and that's the challenge here. Is that insulin also helps to regulate blood vessel dilation, helps to regulate blood pressure, helps to regulate muscle growth, and insulin isn't a bad thing. Like insulin is a hormone that we need in our body, and chronically low levels of insulin can actually have negative side effects. And so it's not that we want to insulin to be as low as possible. The reason that this messaging works so well is it goes back to what I mentioned earlier: is you're convincing people to you're scaring people into doing something, and the something that you're scaring people into doing in this case is avoiding all carbohydrates, or and then in her case, like all processed foods, all carbohydrates, usually everything that's not meat. And you're going to lose weight if you do that. Like, there's no way you're not going to lose weight if you cut out pretty much every food that you eat. And I mean, if I told you to go on a celery diet, you'd lose a whole bunch of weight. And it would, a lot of people for the first 3 months would think I was the smartest person ever, and then they would start to develop nutrient deficiencies. The difference with the animal-based and carnivore diet is the nutrient deficiencies take longer when you're on that that specific diet, because it does meet your needs of like zinc and B12 and iron and some of those other important nutrients. So it'll just take longer for vitamin C and folate and some of these other deficiencies to develop. But that, like we know very clearly that the thing that is most important for fat gain and loss is overall calories. And she, in this video, tries to make it seem that if you eat a lot of carbohydrates, the insulin will cause those carbohydrates to be turned into fat. That doesn't happen. This is called de novo lipogenesis, and this happens at an extremely low rate. There was a study, I think it was published in like 1996, where they overfed people pure sugar, and they looked at how much de novo lipogenesis occurred, and it was very little. What really happened was that people increased their energy expenditure a little bit, and then they reduced the amount of fat that they were burning in their body, and then they burned off all that sugar, and they just used that sugar for fuel. They weren't turning sugar into fat. Anyone who says that sugar is turned into fat and then gets stored is lying to you. Like that happens at a very, very low rate, no matter how much sugar you're eating. And what's easier is your body storing fat as fat. Like it's a whole lot easier. Like it takes multiple steps for your body to take sugar, convert it into fat, and store it as fat. And so this idea that eating sugar makes you fat, but eating fat doesn't get stored as fat, makes zero sense. And as she mentioned, yes, insulin is required for fat to be stored, or for like it'll cause fat not to be released from fat cells. But you can store fat without insulin. If you're eating enough fat, it will still be stored in your fat cells.
Yeah, I would say one important topic to think about too is like, because they demonize insulin, right? And as a byproduct, demonize carbohydrates. It's like, even if you don't eat carbohydrates, you still have a baseline level of insulin,
Yeah.
right? It's not, your insulin is never zero. If you eat protein, you're going to raise your insulin. So it's like, it's kind of silly to be like, insulin is bad, don't eat carbs. It's like, yeah, what about the insulin that's just circulating in your bloodstream at any given time? Is that blocking down, like, is that blocking fat breakdown, And it comes to this conversation of quantity versus like effect size on slowing down fat oxidation. It's not either 100% or 0%, right? We were always having some glucose metabolism, some fat oxidation, and in certain states you could have a little bit more of one versus another. It's just a silly argument, man. And it's also the idea that like the only thing that matters is fat oxidation. As you mentioned, you can store more fat when you eat more fat, right? It's like fat loss, losing body fat, is not simply defined by how much fat you burn, but it's essentially the ratio of how much fat you store versus how much fat you burn. And as Adrian just mentioned, if you have a higher carbohydrate diet, yes, by definition, you may be burning less fat, quote unquote, because you're using less of the fat that you have stored for energy, but you're still using some. It's not like you're using zero. But guess what? On the flip side, if you have a higher carb, lower fat diet, you are storing less fat. So even though you're burning less fat, the ratio between fat storage and fat loss may be very similar to a high fat, low carb diet, right? Where yes, if you have a high fat, low carb diet, if you measure fat oxidation, you have higher rates of fat oxidation because you're using more fat, but you're also storing way more fat. So it's not just how much fat you oxidize, it's the ratio between those two, right? And dude, like, people don't need to understand these mechanisms. If you just look at outcome data, like higher carbohydrate diets have better health related outcomes, but they also have better weight loss outcomes too. Like, and they have not just weight loss, but like for body composition as well, right? Because a lot of the people that listen to my stuff care about body composition, care about building muscle. Like people who have higher carb diets build muscle more effectively, perform better in the gym, lose body fat better, regulate hunger and satiety. And the regulation in hunger and satiety, I wouldn't say is a unique benefit of carbohydrates specifically, but the carbohydrate containing foods are more satiating, right? Like the fruits, the veggies, the whole grains. It's just, I don't know, man. It's hard. It's hard for me to understand why people believe these things, because even if they don't understand the physiology, if you just think about like, hey, are there people around the world that eat a ton of carbohydrates and they're healthy and lean? Yeah. So how could you say that carbs just prevent you from losing body fat, right? I don't know. It's obviously, I don't know, man. People lack common sense, I guess.
I think in those cases, it goes back to what you said earlier. These people they're just good marketers, and they get on these apps and they will say things in sensational ways. Like you said, some people may find her attractive. The way that she speaks is very persuasive. She's like
Relatable.
making it seem like alarmist, so that is going to catch your attention. And then she has these things on the screen, she'll say insulin blocks fat. And if you don't know what insulin is, it's pretty easy to believe that. Not everyone is well versed on what insulin is and what it does and how it works. And for me, you and I know it's very easy to say, "Oh wow, this is outrageous." But that's why I said I know she's going to continue to grow, is because there's just a formula of how to get
Yeah.
into in front of a lot of people and get a lot of people to believe what you're saying, and it doesn't have to have any truth to it.
Yeah.
It's the same with most of what we've already gone over today. Unfortunately, is like there doesn't have to be any truth to it if it sounds like it makes sense and you present it in an alarmist way, and you are like you record the video either in like a grocery store where you can scare people and show the ingredients and like kind of scare people in that way, or you make it look like you're being interviewed and you're in front of a microphone and kind of do it in a way that makes it seem like more credible, like you elevate the credibility of the video. Like there's just a formula, and there are, unfortunately, on social media, there are a lot of people who are just following a formula and they don't have much knowledge at all. I promise you, I'd be willing to bet anything that this woman has not spent any amount of time actually reading anything about nutrition science and actually getting into it, understanding how it works, any of that. She went from diet to diet to diet. She realized that she can convince her friends to follow her along, and was like, oh, wow, let me just go ahead, and this one works for me. And I convinced all my friends to do it. So let me get on social media and convince the world. It ends up being a lot of times what's going on with these things. And if you can put these pieces together in terms of the formula for virality, it's going to get there. And hopefully with these types of episodes, there's a lot of people who are going to see these things. And if we can help people to identify, okay, this is just the type of stuff that they talked about that I just need to be weary of. Because that type of content is not necessarily, that's usually not going to be the type of content you see from people who are trying to teach you. People who are trying to teach you are not going to be presenting things in a black and white way. They're not trying to scare you. If someone actually wants to teach you about a topic, they're not going to start off by trying to scare the hell out of you. Like you're not going to be in a good place to actually understand something if they started off by scaring the shit out of you. And that's never going to be the case. So like it's helpful to really be able to identify those characteristics of that type of content and just scroll past and ignore that stuff.
I think there's also a big difference in terms of the negative implications of a message like this one that we just heard compared to even like the first video where we talked about, right? We're like, man, this first video, there are some half truths here. I don't think it's totally intentionally misleading and supposed to be like really bad. And it's not as alarmist, even though maybe the message could be a little bit more nuanced. And again, to give them credit, maybe we missed some stuff because we just saw a clip from IG. Like don't like all of Paul Saladino's stuff at all. But now that he's like, man, eat plants, eat animals. I still think animals are best, which I don't agree with. But if you eat plants and they work for you and you have a minimally processed diet, that's good. Like that message, even that is more nuanced than if you eat any carbs, the fat sticks to your ass and insulin is bad. It's like, what are you talking about, right? Even the first thing she said, where it's like, fat is fuel for your mitochondria. Fat is the optimal fuel for your mitochondria. It's like, that doesn't make a ton of sense, but it sounds really attractive, right? And the whole idea is that like, hey, fatty acid oxidation partially occurs in the mitochondria, right? And it's like, yeah, but that doesn't mean that fat is a better fuel source for energy. And it's not even fat, it's acetyl-CoA, which people don't know what that is, but it's a 2-carbon molecule that comes from fat, but it can also come from glucose, depending on whether you're anaerobic or aerobic. And
well, that's what I was going to say, is like,
yeah, exactly.
Your mitochondria doesn't know where the acetyl-CoA is coming from.
Exactly. I would say the idea probably comes from like the fact that maybe the majority of acetyl-CoA is coming from fatty acid oxidation, but you can get
She doesn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. She doesn't know the fuck. She doesn't know that.
She has no idea. That's why I didn't even want to say that, because I was thinking this. I'm like, it's both acetyl-CoA, but then we're gonna it's gonna get too complicated. She doesn't know that, and she's just using a buzzword. That's the important piece of the whole thing. It's like mitochondria and cortisol and insulin and inflammation and hormone imbalance and gut imbalance, and these people just use all these buzzwords, and it's you have to learn how to see through that stuff, because otherwise you're gonna think it's really easy. If you don't know what a mitochondria is, and you don't know how energy production in the mitochondria works, and someone says fat is the optimal energy source for your mitochondria, I could actually make that case pretty strongly. You know what I mean? Like, I could make a video and make it seem like that makes complete sense. I could say, well, fat has 9 calories per gram, and it turns into this many ATP molecules versus you can make it seem like it actually is an optimal source if you throw some words together. And
that's how carnitine supplements became really, really popular. It's like carnitine helps shuttle fat into your mitochondria, and you just burn more of it. It's like, nah, man. Like, that's just not like, yes, carnitine is a part of that mechanism, but like, just because you eat more carnitine doesn't mean anything. Just like if you double on your protein intake, you're not going to build twice as much muscle, right? Just like if you sleep 16 hours instead of 8, that doesn't mean you're going to be like that much healthier. It's like,
it's like saying if you put an extra gas tank in your car, you'd be able to drive further. No, you have to fill it up too. Like, it just, you can't just put it there.
But even physiology, it's like, man, just because you eat carnitine doesn't even mean it makes it to the place it needs to get to, and doesn't mean that it's going to double the rate of the process, right? Like, it's complicated, man, because people obviously don't understand. I was going to say something about mitochondria, and then I blanked again. But it's really not that important. What I was going to say is, with a lot of these messages, what I tend to encourage people to do is to think one step further and ask, what does that really mean, right? Like you mentioned, hormone imbalance. Sounds attractive. What does that really mean? What hormones are they talking about? They're imbalanced in what way? And when you start to ask those questions, you start to see the holes in the argument, right? Like, a client of mine today just told me that she needed to take a little bit easy in the gym because her adrenals were hit. And I messaged her, I was like, hey, like, you might be fatigued, you might feel really tired, but like, your adrenals being fatigued is not really a thing. And I shared with her some research on it. But it's like, that's another buzzword, right? It's like, you're not seeing progress in the gym because you have adrenal fatigue. It's like, what does that really mean? Why does that happen? And why do Olympic athletes that train 4 hours a day not have adrenal fatigue, right? Like, it's tough. The buzzword thing is tough, man, because it's very easy to pick complex words, put them together, put together a simple explanation behind them, and that's it. Dude, people that believe these things, it's really difficult, Adrian, because people that believe these things then think that like people like you and I actually don't know anything. Right.
Well, this is the important thing is, these buzzwords, people, if it goes back to what I was saying earlier, what is someone's intent? If they're trying to teach you they're going to try to use as simple language as possible, not as many buzzwords as possible.
Yeah.
People are only using all these buzzwords and putting them all together in this way because they're trying to make you think they're smart. They're not trying to teach you. They're not trying to explain something to help you understand it. There's no part of that that's them trying to do that. It is simply throwing a bunch of words together to make you believe they're smart so that you will believe what they're saying.
Yeah.
And that's why I say that if you see people using these things, it's almost always going to be someone who, even if they're smart, they probably don't have, they're not, either they're not trying to teach you or they're not trying to simplify it enough to make it understandable for the general population. Because if your goal is truly to teach people and you're good at that, you should be able to take these adrenal fatigue and explain to someone, hey, that doesn't really make sense. You're just kind of tired. It's probably just a little bit of soreness. And be able to speak to someone in that way, but then still know what adrenal fatigue is. And like you mentioned, sometimes people don't think you understand the topic very well, but we both got PhDs in this topic. I mean, there are many things that I don't understand very well, but uh, there's not many people on Instagram who understand nutrition better than I do.
Well, it's because we're indoctrinated, dude. But
Yeah.
check this out. What I was going to say is my mom is one of these people that like will listen to this doctor, that doctor online on YouTube specifically. And my mom has been dealing with chronic knee pain for a while. And like, I think a lot of it is personally, some of it is placebo and just like psychological, because when she's in certain environments, she's like perfectly fine. Right. And when she's at home, she has this chronic knee pain and she's tried all sorts of things, gone to all sorts of specialists. They can't tell her what's wrong. She's been dealing with this man for as long as I can remember. And she just recently started following this new doctor, who's a nutrition expert. And she asked me this weekend, like, why have I not told her about this before? If I studied nutrition, how come I didn't know about this cure to her chronic knee pain? So every day now she drinks the juice of 5 limes, just straight 5 limes with a dash of sea salt. And she's like, this has literally cured my knee pain. And this doctor is so smart. And she was like, how come you didn't know about this, Joseph? Like, why haven't you told me about this? And in my mind, I'm just like, listen, I'm not even going to start this conversation. It must just be because I just don't know enough. Like, I'm not going to tell you about placebo and the fact that your mind is playing tricks on you because that's not going to be helpful. Your knee pain's probably going to be back in a couple of weeks, but it is what it is. But like, it's hard to combat those things, man, because as we've talked about, like some people do go on these types of diets or whatnot and do see like objective benefits, right? And now the issue is that the objective benefits are not happening for the reason they think it's happening. And then they're like, oh, Adrian, or oh, Joey, you just like don't know. Like you obviously just don't know the truth. It's hard to combat against that. And I don't think we'll ever be able to combat against that because everything needs some balance and there needs to be some crazies in order for there to be some balance as well. But hopefully, like you mentioned, hopefully episodes and content like this helps people understand things in a slightly more nuanced and balanced way. Anything else you want to bring up?
Yeah, no, this is interesting though. As you're saying all of this, I'm like, man, when I was getting my PhD, I never expected to see some of the stuff that I see now, like the grocery store stuff, the animal based diet stuff where people are eating, the only meat and having cholesterol of 400 and saying that's okay. Like just never expected it. It's interesting that it's that the field has gone in that direction. Unfortunately, hopefully we'll see some correction at some point where some science-based information starts to dominate a little bit more and people start to see through some of this stuff. And that's why I do these type of episodes, is because I know that we've talked about this a bit in I know that a lot of times people people are trying to get the right information, and
Yes.
you're just out seeking the right information, and these people are just really good at marketing. And you're running into persuasive marketers who sometimes can end up messing up your health when you're trying to just do the right things. And that's why I do these type of episodes, and that's why I do this type of content, is I do think that it is helpful to, if 5 people who listen to this were previously, going to fall into one of those rabbit holes, that can be life changing. Because if you fall into one of these rabbit holes of misleading information and start to believe the Primal Bod's information and all the stuff that she's saying, and you sign up for her $3,000 membership program, and she teaches you how to go carnivore, and you destroy your health as a result, that is just not the path you want to go down. And I know that sounds extreme, but as someone who has been working in this field for quite a while with hundreds and hundreds of people, over 1,000 people, definitely at this point, like, I've seen this over and over and over and over and over again. Like, it's not, oh, I've seen it a couple of times. Like, I can tell you story after story after story of people who have fallen for these things and have messed up their health, like truly messed up their health. And it's not, it's sometimes people say, oh, it's just information, don't worry about it. And it's like, yeah, no, it's not just information. You can really harm people's health with these things, and the way that they're indoctrinating people and trying to pull people into these extreme thought processes can really do so much damage. So hopefully, like, if you know someone who's falling for this stuff, please share this episode with them to help them, kind of better understand this.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Let's go ahead and wrap this up. I hope you guys all enjoyed the episode. We're going to publish this on both of our podcasts, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So if you're an Adrian follower, check out my podcast. And if you're my listener, check out Adrian's podcast, even though his is massive and mine is tiny. And we're talking about podcast sizes, not other stuff. But with that said, we'll both be back next week with another episode.